Thank you all for joining us this evening for another in our series of Women of Concord forums. And I hope, if you have not already done so, that you will come see our current temporary exhibit, Every Path Laid Open, Women of Concord and the Quest for Equality, which features many of the individuals you'll learn about this evening, and a photographic portrait of one of tonight's speakers who, in her own right, is helping to fulfill Margaret Fuller's vision that we might live in a society where we would have every path laid open to women as to man. We did a dry run of this conversation last night, and I'm aware we have a lot of ground to cover, so I hope you will forgive me for providing very brief introductions of our speakers in order to get right to the main event. I should say, for anyone tuning in for the first time, I'm Tom Putnam, the director of the Concord Museum. I used to work for the National Archives and Records Administration, which celebrates what they call citizen archivists, individuals who, without formal training in archival studies or history research methods, use the records of our national government in transformative ways. The same can be said about our first speaker this evening, Maria Madison, who has mined the historical record from Concord to Port Deposit, Maryland, from James City, Virginia to Altadena, California, to bring us the heretofore unknown story of Ellen Garrison, a proud daughter of Concord, who, as we will learn more about tonight, left her hometown to teach freedmen in the South and attempted to challenge the nation to enforce our country's first Civil Rights Act of 1866. Dr. Maria Madison's formal training is in public health, with research interests focused on clinical and public health research in Africa and Europe. She is currently the Heller School Associate Dean for Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity at Brandeis University, and she's involved with numerous local organizations to promote civic engagement and meaningful change in a time of growing and severe inequity. She's also a co-founder and co-president of the Robbins House here in Concord, dedicating to raising awareness of Concord's African-American, and anti-slavery past, and the Robbins House is the co-sponsor of this evening's conversation. Dr. Sandra Petrolinas is the author of To Set This World Right, the Anti-Slavery Movement in Thoreau's Concord. I've always appreciated the genesis of that book, which began, as many scholarly projects do, with a different focus. Dr. Petrolinas set out to document the fugitive slaves who passed through Concord and with whom Henry David Thoreau would have interacted. But instead, her research led her to write a book on the little-known women whose activism propelled Thoreau and others to take a more public stand against slavery. As historian Bob Gross has written, quote, Thoreau liked to boast that he marched to a different drummer, but when it comes to protesting slavery, his mother, sisters, and aunts set the beat. In fine detail and lively prose, Sandra Petrolinas restores the women of Concord to their rightful role in the contest against slavery and the shaping of the New England tradition of reform. Dr. Petrolinas is a distinguished professor of English and American Studies at Penn State Altoona and has served as a director of an NEH Summer Institute here in Concord on transcendentalism and reform in the age of Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller. For those of you who participated in our forums in the past, you know that if you ask a question or share a comment, we will randomly select the name of one of those individuals, and we'll send you a copy of Dr. Petrolinas' book, To Set This World Right. So we hope that you'll ask your questions, and I will relay those to our two speakers at the end of the program. So let me now turn this discussion over to Dr. Maria Madison and Sandra Petrolinas.
Thank you so much, Tom, and the Concord Museum, as well as our colleague, Sandra Petrolinas. We are exceptionally honored to be able to have this conversation this evening, particularly as I want to frame it as an oral epistolary, which is a collection of letters that try to tell a story. And so what's exciting about this evening is that we're going to be describing the first person voice of a young African-American woman who was born and raised in Concord. I think it's a particularly poignant moment because with the advent of cell phones, we are now communicating primarily through texts. And to be able to step back in time and think about that particular art of letter writing and deciphering messages and ideas through those letters is an art form that's lost to us. And we're able to do that this evening, particularly because of you, Sandra, as well as Bob Gross and others who helped us discover the letters of Ellen Garrison. So we're inviting you to travel back in time with us through the Robbins House. I'm going to do just a quick overview of Ellen Garrison and the Robbins House, and then ask you, Sandra, as well, to just join in dialogue about what we think and see related to Ellen's voice presented through her actions and her words. So just to situate us, the house you're looking at here is the Robbins House. It's a 544 square foot, considered to be a yeoman's house, that was deeded to Ellen Garrison's uncle, Peter Robbins. And the deed stipulated that Ellen's family lived on the right half of that house, while Peter, her uncle, lived on the left half of the house. So this evening, we're focusing on Ellen Garrison Jackson, who lived in that right half of that house. She was born and raised and lived there until she was about 17 or 18 years of age. And we like to say the house commemorates the legacy of a previously enslaved Revolutionary War veteran by the name of Caesar Robbins, her grandfather. He unfortunately died the year before she was married. She didn't know him, but she certainly heard a lot of stories about what it was like to have been enslaved, particularly in New England, particularly in Concord and Chelmsford, where her grandfather had been enslaved, but also from the stories of her own father, Jack Garrison, who was a fugitive from New Jersey. Sandra, do you want to describe a little bit about that time period, 1820s?
Excuse me, and yes, thank you, Maria, for that introduction, and thank you, Tom, as well. I would like to point out that the Robbins House, thanks to your direction, it has been very successful in moving this house from its former location on Bedford Road, I believe, to now being directly across the street from the Minuteman National Historic Park. So for those of you who haven't been to Concord, haven't visited the Robbins House, it's now functioning as an educational center with many commemorative and excellent tours and events, including on July 4th every year, a public reading of Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." But there really couldn't be a better location for this home, giving the shot heard around the world, of course, one more very important arc and meaning to the story of Concord. And so I just love what you've done, Maria, what all of you have done. And I know it's been a lot of work and 15 or 20 years now in the making since that's all taken place. But the physical geography of the story that you're still unfolding constantly is really impressive. Ellen Garrison lived in Concord at a time, the antebellum era, 1830s, born in 1823. She's really a contemporary of Henry Thoreau's, about 6 years or so younger than he was. And we're talking about a Concord whose population at this time is just slightly more than 2,000 people, about 28-30 of whom were African American. So we're still living very much in a time where the town is primarily agricultural, but manufacturing is becoming certainly an important part of the town's economy. And Ellen's family, her mother, her father, participated greatly in the just nascent activism that was starting there in the early 1830s and really got underway after William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator was founded, and some of those abolitionists migrated over and lived in Concord for a time. By the late 1830s, 1837 specifically, the women of Concord followed on the heels of visits there and speeches there by Angelina and Sarah Grimke, two abolitionists from South Carolina. And they formed, as many local towns were in the area, a local female anti-slavery society. And we can document from the beginning, the Concord Society was interracial with the Garrison family belonging, at least. We're not sure if any of the other Black residents of Concord joined, but we know that Susan Garrison, Ellen's mother, actually hosted the second meeting in her home, presumably this home on Bedford Road, though, in its former location in December 1837. Whether Ellen at that time would have been, she was a teenager, whether she attended those meetings and helped host, we don't know, but certainly we like to think so, because as you'll hear more from shortly, the activism of her mother, of her early life that would have surrounded her in that home, was very much a part of the personality and an activist and a civil rights crusader really throughout her entire life. And she took that into her classroom as well, which is an exciting story that's, again, still unfolding, as Maria will tell you.
Thank you. I think what we want to do with you all as the audience is join us in thinking about how we interpret, the house, how we interpret the letters from Ellen, and what that tells us about the long civil rights movement, where we are today, and how that may or may not be portrayed through the stories of the families that lived in this house. The house was originally located on what the town calls Caesar's Woods, eponymously named for Ellen's grandfather, which is right now behind the wastewater treatment plant. And in a journal entry from Thoreau, he describes that some of the food, in particular, a pig's head, I believe, doesn't come easily to this outcast family. So Thoreau is actually already setting the scene for us that the Robbins family, per some, were well integrated and excellent scholars, but per Thoreau, were considered an outcast family and moved to the margins of the community, living off in the less than arable land, less farmable, over actually about 600 yards from where the house is currently located. But instead of reading the tea leaves, we can now read the actual words of Ellen Garrison. And we can do so because of, again, some of the wonderful work of our colleagues through a grant that we received, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We were able to work with our historians that include Bob Gross, Lois Brown, Carrie Greenidge, John Hannigan, so many individuals, Joanne Pope-Mellish, and not the least of which is, again, thanks to Sandra Petrolionis, who's helping us to also analyze and interpret a lot of this information. But some of the earliest information that we get that help us to interpret who this family was, and in particular through Ellen Garrison, because she was able to learn how to read and write in Concord, we can see their activism, we can see their voice. And here we see, for example, that Ellen signed 5 petitions, and you can see her penmanship off to the left, and that's the penmanship, we believe, of Ellen signing on behalf, perhaps, of her mother, Susan Garrison, her sister, whose name was also Susan Garrison. And then, Sandra, do you want to tell us a little bit about this 4th signatory?
I'm afraid that I know only that she was a visiting friend at the time that this petition was being signed, Emmeline Chester. I think she's about 21 years old at this point in 1838, and she's from Boxborough. And I think that one of your historian advisors, Joanne Mellish, or perhaps Ann Forbes, was the source of that information. So likely there's more to be told, but that's unfortunately all I know about her.
Well, and that also just highlights that we are able to piece all this together because of all the extraordinary Concordians and partners and friends helping us do that, including Ann Forbes and Liz Clayton and so many folks. So among these 5 petitions that Ellen alone signed, we begin to see this young girl born and raised in Concord who begins to not only be an excellent scholar, but an activist. So by the time she's 15 in 1838, we're seeing her sign a petition on behalf of the land rights of the Cherokee, because the country was removing the Cherokee from their land reportedly for various reasons. Some would say also to acquire the land to pay for debts by finding and mining gold on that property, but nonetheless resulting in the Trail of Tears. We see her doing that at 15, and then gradually over time from 18 to 20 to 21, we see her signing additional petitions, including an 1843 one to try and demand equal rights to access to public transportation, access to railroads, to desegregate the school system, for example, or to secede from the Union, or in the case of a stay of execution for a Black sailor by the name of Washington Good. So we begin to see not just Ellen, but her family members and others in this region signing petitions demonstrating their activism, their agency, and their voice. Do you want to add your thoughts about petitions at that time?
One of the things that strikes me, and there's so many of these petitions now that we can look at digitally that we didn't used to have access to be able to make some of these conclusions, but it's striking that as early as 1838, certainly on the subject of the protests against the New Echota Treaty, as well as the anti-slavery petitions that Concord residents submitted, there were petitions that the men and women both signed and submitted, but the women also submitted their own. So in the instance with this one, in the example of this one in 1838, the women's petition contained over 300 names of women in Concord who signed this, whereas the men's petition, that was specifically men in this case, contained only 174 names. So it's a striking situation that even in the very earliest days of women establishing this political identity and taking on this role that was quite new for them, that they did so in numbers that were really double, at least in this specific case, that of the men. When Ellen went to to Boston, which she did around age 18, she specifically wanted to connect with the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. And so one of the few letters we have that mentions her childhood in Concord at all is a letter from abolitionist in Concord, Mary Brooks, on behalf of Ellen. She's introducing her in this short letter to Maria Weston Chapman, who was the head of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. And she's bragging about what a strong student who has borne away the prize for honors that Ellen has had, and specifically saying she is interested in your society, has been active in ours, and hopes to be part of yours as well. So, you know, that initial activism, perhaps given, adopted by her mother or fomented by her mother, certainly was something she wanted to take up and did, as these other petitions make clear, Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, and one of the things that stands out for me, which I'm going to ask the audience to sort of put in the parking lot, is the 1843 one, which is her already thinking about the deliberate action of protest by sitting down and the effort to desegregate railroads, allowing for all individuals to sit wherever they would like in any car in public transportation, for example. So 1843, we already see her saying there should be a right to be seated wherever you'd like as a citizen of this country. So we build that arch. There's so much to say about these petitions, but we're going to rush through them to get to the letters. But we build that arch where you begin to see, again, Ellen born and raised in that house, 1823. Then by the time she's in her 20s, signing petitions and moving to Boston. And as she's moving to Boston, we also begin to see through broadsides, which look a little bit like this one on the right-hand side, that her activism is also as an organizer to celebrate the efforts and initiatives of other anti-slavery activists and abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, or William Wells Brown, who's a prominent anti-slavery author and spokesman, and also as well to work with William Wells Brown to create a monument to a gentleman who was considered to be the father of the Underground Railroad, who is Torrey, Charles Torrey. So in that red box in the lower right-hand side, you can see her name listed as a committee of the organizers to celebrate some of these individuals. And they're having these events also at or on Beacon Hill. And she's a member of the Beacon Hill Church, or the Boston Baptist Church on Joy Street, which was also founded by her uncle Obed. So she's already integrating herself in a very activist, Black activist community, particularly on Beacon Hill. So by 1863, we begin the treasure chest of 100 of her letters, including school reports. And what we see is that in 1863, which, as you'll recall, is the same year as the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed enslaved people in the rebellious southern states, that Ellen knows this. And so she's writing. She's writing as a teacher in Boston. She's already a teacher, and she's writing to become, or request to become, a teacher as a part of the Reconstruction era's Freedmen's Bureau on behalf of an organization called the American Missionary Association. Ellen writes, "I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves? And who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them?" Thoughts, Sandra? I'm going to drink a little water as you share your read.
I love this letter because it shows so much about who she has become by this time, not only as an African-American activist for the 40 years of her life, but as a teacher, and absolutely connecting and aware that, as a teacher would be by now, how much you need to be able to empathize and identify with the needs of your students. And we'll get to a couple of letters in a moment where she's making comparisons and conclusions about the characteristics and the character of Northern free Black people like herself versus the students that she's teaching soon in the South. And I think that shows us another connection of what she already understands about herself as a teacher, who will be able to meet their needs, not just for education, but for a sympathetic understanding of what freedom needs to mean for these people.
Absolutely.
So this letter is showing it just beautifully. I would also add here that scholars of the movement of the freed teachers and so forth are still constantly looking for the motivations of these different teachers, white teachers, Black teachers, men, women, and they apparently still find it difficult to really discern who was motivated in what way. And so what I love about this letter too is that Ellen just tells us right off the bat, here is why I want to go and here's what I want to do. And you don't have to wonder and look, it's not a mystery.
Absolutely. And I'm intrigued by that last sentence, that last question, who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them? And, we ask ourselves, what was life like for them in Concord? Was it good? Was it difficult? We're leaving out a lot of stories that we could be sharing about her experiences. But, some would say that they were well integrated and some would say they were ostracized, the outcast family. And here she says, who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them? My interpretation is that she does not trust whites, that she thinks Blacks need to help Blacks, and who can feel the sympathy that Blacks can. So it's an interesting tea leaves again.
Well, especially in the next letters as well, where we see the mistreatment that she suffers, even as a teacher and as an adult who should have the respect of everyone on the streets, and she doesn't. And so she's very aware as a teacher what her students must be suffering as well.
Absolutely. And then we begin to see a little bit more of what she's like. We actually don't have a picture of her, but we know in order to get a job through the American Missionary Association with the Freedmen's Bureau, she actually has to qualify And their qualifications, I love their qualifications. The missionary spirit qualification is that you have to be prepared to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So you have to be a true Christian. And none should go then who are influenced by either romantic or mercenary motives, who go for the poetry or the pay, who wish to go south because they have failed at the north. Health. This is not a hygienic association to help invalids try a change of air or travel at others' expense. Energy, you have to be healthy and strong. You can't go if you are not also a good disciple of Christ and should be devoted to working on behalf of the poor. And you need to be prepared to teach in the Sabbath school. So we know she's applying to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. She's also required to teach Sunday school.
Right.
Culture and common sense, that it is a mistaken and mischievous idea that almost anybody can teach the freedmen. They only should be commissioned least likely to make mistakes, where mistakes when made can so seldom be corrected. Personal habits, they don't want anyone who is addicted to tobacco or opium. They literally state, neither should any be commissioned who are addicted to use of tobacco or opium, or are not pledged to total abstinence from intoxicating drinks. So we know she doesn't drink alcohol. We know she doesn't smoke. We know that she's not also using opium. And then experience. They require some experience. So we know she's also a teacher, and she's been teaching before she joins. So she is admitted as a teacher. And in her first letter requesting to be a teacher, she also wants them to know, the Freedmen's Bureau to know, that she was born in Concord and she's a member of the Baptist Church, Joy Street, Boston. She's establishing herself as a credible, focused, scholarly teacher on a mission, and a Christian as well. And this is just the actual photo of her father, Jack Garrison. The photo is available in the Concord Museum alongside a photo of her brother, John Garrison, which you can see by visiting the Concord Museum. So what we learn is she's accepted into teaching on behalf of the Freedmen's Bureau through the American Missionary Association. And her first position is in Port Deposit, Maryland, which is located on the Susquehanna River, which is at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And as Bob Gross reminded me beautifully, this is a poetic corner of the world for the sails as well as the train station. So I'm going to pause there. And Sandy, do you want to read the tea leaves?
I think that you have the lovely excerpt from Frederick Douglass's narrative to read, because what Ellen actually does geographically as she travels from Concord to Port Deposit, Maryland, is take the opposite journey that Douglass had taken himself in 1838 when he left his position on the docks of Baltimore to escape and make it to freedom. So I'll turn it back to you for that excerpt, which is just a lovely way to imagine the two of them meeting at that spot.
And what Frederick Douglass states 30 years before Ellen gets her appointment to teach in Port Deposit, in his narrative, he says, "Sails, you are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gently gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. Your freedom's swift winged angels that fly round the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. I will run away. You've seen how man was made a slave. Now you will see how a slave is made a man." And he then takes upon himself to travel through to this train station at the railroad of the Baltimore-Philadelphia train station, which is juxtaposed near to Port Deposit, Maryland. and Ellen too travels through that same train station. What we find in one of Ellen's first letters of 1865, which is the same year as the 13th Amendment, Ellen is applying to be a teacher right at the period of Emancipation Proclamation. But by the time she's given an appointment, it's 1865, and that's the year the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolishes slavery throughout the United States. Ellen begins to write her letters of what it's like to teach in the South and in Port Deposit. And a couple of the excerpts from her first letters in 1865 describe that she's now exposed to the kind of discrimination and harassment that may not have been what she'd experienced in Concord or Boston. She writes, and I'll quote, "It is only occasionally that I have been beaten or stoned in the street by the boys, but my scholars are not so fortunate. They pelt them with missiles frequently so that the parents of some will not send them to school. Last 4th of July, someone came up behind me and trod on my dress and called me the N-word. I found out one thing about these people. If they attack you, be careful to stand your ground and they will leave you. But if you run, they will follow."
Several of the letters contain other examples that are just shocking in the treatment that would have been afforded to a teacher. The fact that she is forced off the sidewalk, thinking she's being polite to allow room for people coming toward her, and realizing when they get even with her that they were just going to force her off or take more room than the children needed, or again, step on her skirt and so forth. But we do see her sympathy, to go back to that first letter, for her students, and the understanding that the reason so many parents aren't willing to send their children to school is because of the distance they have to walk. And she names particular neighborhoods that are well known for the mistreatment and the abusive language. And so she's always looking in her letters, she's talking about looking for ways to make that trip different for them, or to somehow have adults that will meet and walk with them so that they're not forced to make that journey on their own.
And even Du Bois describes that these are, many of them, courageous women. Du Bois says, "Rich and poor they were, serious and curious, bereaved now of a father, now of a brother, now of more than these. They came seeking a life work in planting New England schoolhouses among the white and black of the South. They did their work well. In that first year, they taught 100,000 souls and more." So he notes that they're coming as well with their own experiences of pain during this period, but nonetheless have taken on this charge to go and teach the freedmen of the South. And it included blacks and whites, right, Sandy? Some of the classrooms were,
Yeah, well, and we see that in the reports, which we'll look at in a minute.
So as we begin to see Ellen's letters over that period of the Reconstruction era, which Eric Foner and Du Bois and David Breon Davis, others, describe as this period from around 65 to 77. Someone would say 63 or 67 to 77. But we begin to see all of Ellen's letters, and you can see to the right her penmanship. This is a photocopy of one of her letters, which is why the work that Sandra has done with her students is instrumental in helping us to truly know and decipher. Her handwriting is beautiful for the period, but it was helpful to have that transcription. So what we see over that time period is this arc of her experiences again. In 65, Ellen writes, "The free people here are generally free people, not freed men."
Mm-hmm.
By this, I imagine we could all interpret this in various ways. But I think, Sandy, that what she's saying is that they may no longer be enslaved because of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, but they aren't actually feeling like they can exhibit their true agency. They don't have self-determination. They're still feeling terrorized, demonized, um, disenfranchised. They aren't feeling free. Is that how you?
No, exactly. I think it connects again. There's a lovely symmetry there with Douglas's own remark on the difference or the way in which he's writing himself into being, into manhood itself. There's another letter that same month, but to a different correspondent, where she is going into a little bit more detail in the difference between the Northern and Southern Blacks. And she says, the difference in behavior here from what she calls, quote, Northern free people is that the Southern Blacks aren't, quote, yet accustomed to free laws and free speech and freedom. So just as you've said, that self-awareness of their own personhood is still something she's trying to make happen for them in her classroom.
Yeah, which is, triply confounding, because this sense is, the slave went free. And the idea of the Freedmen's Bureau was to provide now for the opportunity to read and write, and perhaps 40 acres and a mule, land, a bank, the Freedmen's Bank, the ability to develop self-determination in an equitable way. But of course, tonight we're not discussing Reconstruction writ large, but we see through Ellen's letters that the slave went free, in the words of W.B. Du Bois, stood a moment in the sun, which is, we're free, now we can learn to read and write, but then is returned back to slavery, to quote Du Bois. And so we're going to try and piece that together with everyone right now through Ellen's words, because what we see is by 1866, Ellen is beginning to write in her letters that she had to go to that same train station that we saw in the prior slide, that Baltimore-Philadelphia train station, because she needed to replace clothing that was burned from the house she was living in March. And so while she's sitting in the train station, on two occasions, she was told that she didn't have the right to sit there. And in fact, on one of those occasions, a fellow, an Adam Smizer, forcibly ejects her. In her own words, she says, an outrage has just occurred. And she's writing her supervisor, a General Stannard, working on behalf of the Freedmen's Bureau. She says, it was nothing less than the forcible ejection of myself and a Black teacher colleague, Miss Anderson, from the railroad waiting room. She says, we were injured in our persons as well as our feelings, for it was with no gentle hand that we were assisted from that room. She says, we went to Baltimore on Friday evening and presented ourselves at court on Saturday morning because we wanted to raise a legal case against Adam Smizer, not because he forcibly ejected her, but because, as she describes in her letters, he was impersonating a police officer, and she thought that would be a much easier case. So she actually raises the case, and her supervisor says that he will support her. Her white male Freedmen Bureau supervisor says, yes, you have a case. And so she goes there, and the lawyers on behalf of Adam Smizer suggest that maybe she should compromise. They're willing to compromise because the case against Adam Smizer impersonating a police officer initially may have seemed just or justified. And it would have been a $400 sentence. And Ellen says she's not going to compromise. Instead, she says, the colored people of Baltimore came to our aid in a very unexpected manner. They said they would assist us with this case by giving us their money to continue the case. And by no means to give in, but to test it and find whether we have civil rights or not. They said it concerned them all. And what they want to test is the fact that in April of 1866, the country had just passed the first Civil Rights Act, which was April 6th of 1866. So in the same way, I like to imagine that she signed that petition in 1843 for the freedom to circulate on public transportation like the railroad. Here we have her 20 years later doing it deliberately by sitting in a woman's waiting room because she knew, as she says in a letter, that their friends in Congress had passed a law that should protect their rights. She felt it was their duty to test their rights. Yeah.
Just a very quick PS to that before you move on. I love another moment in that same letter.
Yes.
Just because of the wording she uses. She says, it certainly requires a degree of moral courage to act in this matter. It is no trifling subject. And, I like to hear all of the descendants of the Civil Rights Act that she's undertaking at this moment, as well as think back to the transcendentalists of the community in which she's come from Concord. That phrase moral courage just seems really striking as she's describing what is really anger at this point, but she has it so well under control and she's so confident in what she's setting out to do. She's determined that she's right.
That's great. She's determined, and meanwhile, she's also doing her job. So you can see in her eloquent voice and her even handwriting, she knows that while she's pushing for equality, especially civil obedience, to follow a law that had been enacted, as opposed to civil disobedience against an unjust law, she's still trying to do her job. And we see her doing that by submitting these school reports at the same time. Do you want to talk about the school reports?
I would love to start out by just making the point that there's so much data to be mined, yet there's so much work still to be done, not just in recovering new caches of letters that about people we don't even really fully know at all, but these school reports, they flesh out the letters and they document and give us the actual data to support what the letters have said, but to also raise all kinds of new questions about things that Ellen doesn't talk about in her letters. And so she had to submit these monthly, and you can see one from Maryland and then the other in 1869 from a school when she was in Virginia, James Creek. But you find out the ages and numbers of the students. You're struck by the seasonality of their work, the fact that the parents will bring them home to work when it's harvest season or in other moments, planting season. And so they can't be in school as often as she wants. In one letter, she complains that the parents say, work, 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 while I say, educate, educate, educate. Well, these school reports make that much more clear to you when you see these months that certain boys, particularly of certain ages, are not there. You also learn the things that they celebrated, exhibitions that the students presented, holidays that they observed. So there's just a lot of information here, and what seems like very straightforward, basic information. You also see her pride in the letters about the growing numbers, the increasing numbers of students that she has after she takes over the school. And so these reports certainly document and prove that as well.
Yeah, you get the sense that she's appreciated by the community, but we'll show in a couple of minutes, that we're all complicated and viewed in complicated ways by various individuals. But before we do that, we do want to, pause and just appreciate how we, have been able to be allowed to interpret this information because it's been transcribed.
Well, it was a labor of love, but it was also a labor of gratitude that from me to you and the Robbins House, that I had the ability to present this opportunity to my students. I talk to them constantly in the classroom about the importance of ongoing recovery efforts when it comes to the voices that aren't yet back in the historical record and popular knowledge the way that they should be. So for undergraduates like mine to actually be given the opportunity to contribute to this recovery effort. Most of my projects involving students are long-term, and it might be years before anything results that the student is going to see that they did. And in this case, the transcription effort of Ellen's letters was handled by 2 students, and they were able to see the payoff in the form of your exhibits at the Robbins House within a matter of a year and a half, I think it was. So it was exciting for me to watch them do it, to participate and teach them the skills of transcribing and providing this information in a meticulous and correct way. But you know, the most exciting thing was having them look on your website a year later and see the results of what they've done.
And so we can truly appreciate the work that they did. Here
Yes.
is Ellen's stunning, you know, again, think about the first slide we had, which was us texting, which I don't do with my thumbs, by the way. I'm one of those index finger people. But imagine, when was the last time we wrote a letter? And when could I have ever written a letter with such beautiful penmanship? But that aside, the transcription process made all of our interpretation so much more possible. And so we were able to go from something like this, as beautiful as it is, to these transcriptions. And it's through that
it wasn't, excuse me, but it wasn't even that beautiful, because they were transcribing from Xerox copies of microfilm, whereas it's only recently that we've purchased the digital images that give us the much more clear images. So shout out to both of them for that.
Yeah, a huge appreciation, and we need to celebrate them, because it's through them that we can dig deeper into Ellen's voice. And here's another one of her quotes, again, related to her stand at that railroad station waiting room. She says, "I feel as though I ought to strive to maintain my rights. As long as our friends have passed a law for our protection, we ought to contend for our rights and let our friends see that we appreciate their efforts on our behalf." So what we then eventually did was tried to find out the outcome of her legal case, of her attempt to legally test the nation's first Civil Rights Act. So we literally went to the Maryland State Archives and dug through this 19th century, along with 5 other dockets of court cases from the 19th century, and flipped through them with my colleagues, Ilan Cook and Liz Clayton, and went page by page. These are our plastic gloves, and we discovered the outcome of the case. And leading up to the outcome of the case is this quote from Ellen, May 21st, where she writes to one of her friends, Reverend Hunt, "We went to the court as requested, but the case was not called. Our opponent's counsel consulted with ours and requested a compromise, which proposition being unexpected by us required consideration. We could not agree to a compromise, as we discussed earlier, just then, and no other time, unless we can have all our rights conceded to us." She says the courtroom was crowded. "We must stand firm to the last." And then when you look at the docket, there's an entry from 1866, July. It says that the Maryland grand jury dismissed Ellen's court case against the railroad station master. The docket states, and I quote, "N period E period," which according to the Maryland State Archivist suggests non est inventus. Transcribed is not to be found. At the sheriff's return of process, when service is not made because the person was not found, they write N period E period, suggesting that they dismissed the case because they couldn't find Ellen, which is seemingly at odds with Ellen's own letter entry for that period, which is the courtroom was crowded and we must stand firm to the last. So the case was dismissed, and we don't hear any more about it from Ellen's letters. In fact, what we see is that she goes on to teach not only in Port Deposit, but as you described earlier, Sandy, she goes on to teach in Chickahominy County, James City County, Virginia. And what we find there is by 1868, not everybody is viewing these freedom school teachers, but particularly Ellen, in a missionary perspective. In fact, a Black school committee in Port Deposit wanted her to be removed because they didn't feel that she had a philanthropic spirit. We can interpret that, again, tea leaves in various ways. And they also voiced their concern about her because they said she meddled with this or that discrimination. So, Sandy, what are your tea leaves?
Well, what I also appreciate,
Yeah.
this tells us so much, but there's another letter from another group of 3 or 4 men who are aware of this letter. And so they follow it up with theirs, disputing the complaints that these men are making. And they brag about Ellen and say that they want her back. And they are aware of the controversy and they disagree with it. And so they're writing to not only reestablish that her character has been fine and that she's been a great teacher, but to ask for her to come back. So I think it's interesting because it certainly lets us know that there was never unanimity of opinion. Just because there was a Black teacher in a school didn't mean that everybody was valuing her in the same way, and that they had different levels of requirements and preferences in terms of what they expected out of the teacher.
That's right. And it's hard for us to know if, it's 1868 and she was pushing for, adherence to the 1866 law 2 years previously. So what was she doing between 66 and 68 that they're still thinking of her as a meddler?
Yeah, I think we only have a couple of letters in 67. That year is very quiet for her course.
Yeah. But what we do see by the end of the arc of her 100 or so letters and school reports is, by 1869, one of her last letters, she says, I would recommend everyone who comes out into the country to teach to carry a few things with them, such as a knife and a fork, spoon, cup, and saucer. They will be needed. So again, she's giving us hints, as she does in so many letters, about not just the needs of her students in terms of, food, but also books and needing her salary. And there's just a wide array of lack of resources for school teachers and families. She also then in that last letter describes how her last exercise with the students is to ask them to participate in a play called The Rival Orators, which really teaches students how to stand up for their rights. But she also asked them in the end to sing a song, and the song she has them sing is Where Liberty Dwells, There Is My Country. And I recommend everybody look this up online because it's a poetic reverence to, I think, freedom and citizenship. Here I read the tea leaves as she truly sees herself as an American citizen, birthright citizenship, that this is her country and she's going to do whatever she can to teach the free people. Mm-hmm. So from there, we see the demise of the Reconstruction era. We see the end of the Freedmen's Bureau. And with that, we see Ellen losing her teaching job. And she moves to Kansas, Barton County, where we see her and a husband listed in the roles of citizens in Barton County, Kansas, which again is a whole chapter around exodusters and the promise of Black agency and economy in a freed person's community, which is a false promise because of the exoduster concept. It was a dusty, non-arable, non-farmable land. And so although they owned lots of property, they also found it difficult, along with the other Black communities in Kansas, found it difficult to actually survive. So what we see is that Ellen and her husband, her second husband at that time, whose name is Harvey Clark, as well as her sister, travel and end up in Southern California, in Altadena, California, where we see them finally resting in Mountain View Cemetery, which is noted as she's died from tuberculosis, described as consumption by 1892. And that Mountain View Cemetery, described by a descendant of John Brown, was created for John Brown's family and his descendants and friends, and supposedly noting particularly his New England friends. And so this trajectory is an interesting one. I don't know if you want to speak to that briefly, Sandy, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, I know we're getting short of time too, so I'll just say that I think there's, as you've laid it out already, there's a fascinating story there to be told with that geographical movement, not only John Brown in Kansas, but then his family. A story that's been well told in a book by Bonnie Laughlin Schultz, the women of his family and two of the sons ending up in Altadena, and there's Ellen and her family. And in fact, as you've discovered, we have photographs commemorating at this ceremony and some other celebrations on John Brown anniversaries with unnamed, unidentified Black women, at least one right in the center of that photo. And we don't know who that is, but we love to imagine.
Yeah. So we have a few more. I think we want to open it up to questions and answers.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes, I think so.
Well, thank you both so much. It was fascinating. I so appreciated reading the letters over the weekend. And we have some good questions, and let's try to keep your answers brief. I think most of them lend themselves to fairly brief answers. So the first one was, Ellen was qualified to teach for the American Missionary Association and clearly passionate about the work. What was her own education like growing up in Concord?
Yeah, I can take a short stab at that, and I will say, and all errors are my credit. All accuracies are Bob Gross's, but I asked Professor Bob Gross, if you don't know him, he's a Concord historian on the Minutemen in their world, and just really critical to us beginning to unravel some of the stories that we've been sharing. But, when I asked him, and he's publishing a book forthcoming shortly that goes into greater detail about this, she went to a school just like other white kids in Concord at the time. There were not segregated schools. And these were like Montessori schools. You would be different ages in the same school. They weren't K through 6 or 12, but they were more like, I think, 1st through 6th grade level. And so she was a top scholar in a school that probably, taught arithmetic, geography, etc., through 6th grade level. But that it wasn't also in the same seasons that we have now. It was when you didn't have to work on the farm or when you were available to be present. But Sandy, do you want to add to?
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, I have a question for you, Sandy. Why don't you take this one? Where are the letters housed? And individual wants to know, if the public can read them, and maybe I'll also add, how are they discovered?
Well, Bob Gross, to my knowledge, discovered them when he was in that archive. They're at Tulane University in the American Missionary Association collection of the Amistad archives. So it's at Tulane in New Orleans. And he was there, is my understanding, Maria, doing research on something else and happened across them, found them, and they came to my attention because Maria and I were having lunch in Concord one summer, and she was describing these manuscript letters. And I said, yeah, but who's going to transcribe them? You can't read them, you can't search them. And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, I think I do. And because I've been working with students for a long time on various transcription projects. So it became something that I was successful in convincing Penn State to support. But I think there are close to 100 letters. And to my knowledge, they're not digitally available, but you can read them very clearly in black and white at the Robbins House in Concord. I don't
And
know.
I haven't talked to Maria about this, but if it's possible and if Tulane allows it, we'd certainly be willing to partner to make sure that they are available, digitally online at some point. So whatever we can do. Okay, Maria, this one's for you, and the next one is better for you, Sandy. So Maria, the one is, I'm so struck by Ellen's words, quote, if they attack, stand your ground. How would you interpret, project Ellen's words for students and for teachers today? What can she teach us in this current moment?
Those words that individual pulled out really summarize Ellen and the long civil rights movement, which is don't give up, keep pushing forward, because many of the major laws and civil rights successes throughout history have come through Black movements. And so what we see through Ellen's story is that because she stood her ground, the Black townspeople around Port Deposit supported her financially. Because she stood her ground, she was able to draw attention to her court case and connect with major anti-slavery activists and abolitionists to move forward with her efforts. I will say that her letters suggest that even in the fight even in view of adversity, which is the demise of the Reconstruction era, losing her job as a teacher, you still see her going on to teach. You see her never giving up. So overcoming adversity, I would say, is the message, is that that's what she taught and that's how she lived. And she saw that's what her grandfather did who had been enslaved. That's what she saw her own father doing who had been enslaved. So overcoming adversity.
Great, Sandy, this one's for you. Are there any documented interactions between Ellen Garrison and Henry David Thoreau?
No, there are not. That does not, however, mean that there were none, because we know from various sources that William and Ellen Craft were in Concord to speak on nights that he was certainly in town. I can't believe he didn't go. Annie Brown, John Brown's daughter, attended school in Concord and remarks on meeting him and says he reminds her of her father. Thoreau doesn't ever mention her. So the fact that he doesn't mention Ellen in his letters or journal, I don't think is any indication at all that he didn't know her, didn't interact with her. We know that his sisters and mother paid a call at least once socially to her mother's home. She would have been there. I have to imagine that he knew her, that there would have been some meeting, but no, we have nothing documenting it.
We do have the documentation, though, in his journal entries of his observing and interacting with Peter Hutchinson, who's a non-blood likely relative who also lived in the Robbins house. He talks about seeing Peter Hutchinson, over behind Abiel Haywood's house, describing the red oak from the gray oak. Yeah, but right. We also see John Garrison preparing the garden, the wedding garden for Hawthorne in front of the old manse. So we know he had to have known about her.
Absolutely.
And I think the question for me would be, he doesn't write about women that much at all. So Ellen might have been just, yeah.
Not too much. Mary Moody, Emerson, and Sarah Ripley, notable elderly women exceptions, but you're right.
Maria, this one's for you. Is there a gravestone in California? I know you're thinking of placing a marker. Is that in addition to a gravestone, or is her grave currently unmarked?
So that's such an exciting question. We have photographs of the cemetery put red flags to mark where her casket is. And they put, I'm assuming there's a casket, and they put red flags where her husband Harvey Clark's casket is. And they are now very interested in helping us put a marker, but markers should be placed by descendants. And so they first have to make sure they can't find any descendants. So we're working hard to also determine whether there are any or not, and then they are willing to and interested in putting in a marker.
Okay, so the last question is a big one, and I'll let either both of you use it as a platform to give us a closing remark, however you like to do it. Here it is. Do you think we will ever see the day when everyone will be treated equally and we will be able to live in harmony?
Oh. Well, I'll let Maria have the last word, so I'll start on that and say that I have to believe that that's possible because I'm still teaching. And if anything has given me tremendous hope and pride over this past year, it's been this young generation, what they have accomplished, what they believe in. I have to think as a teacher and as a person and as an American is giving us a reason to be hopeful that yes, that is going to happen. Whether it happens soon enough, probably we will all agree that it won't, but I have to believe it's possible.
It is possible if we all commit to providing and searching for all the first person narratives and presenting them and interpreting them together. I think as we showed tonight, we can read someone's first person words and still try to understand what they were saying. And it requires us to be in conversation to do that. It requires a dialogue to do that. So we first have to look for those original and deep and honest stories through oral histories as well as written words, and revamp our educational system. I think that when I meet people who seem to be hesitant or resistant, I think it's because the educational system has failed us. So I think it's all of our responsibility to find a way to raise up the voices of the historical voices of our multicultural fabric that created this country. And the only way we could be having this call right now in heated rooms with light and electricity and pens, look up Black inventors, look up Indigenous inventors, look up white inventors. We wouldn't be where we are today without that pluralistic, multicultural contribution to the privileges that some of us have or do not have. We need to dig deeper into the Indigenous contributions and all those who came after that allow us to be where we are right now.
Well, if our educational system is succeeding, it is due to the energies and passion of educators and researchers and scholars like the two of you. So we thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I want to thank all of you who are viewing from home, and I'm sure you agree with me what a moving and engaging story we were just treated to. I hope you'll join us for our next forum, which is Tuesday, June 22nd. I think it will be an interesting, equally interesting evening. Harvard professor Tia Miles on her new book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley's Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which is the story of a cotton sack that was packed by an enslaved mother for her 9-year-old daughter when the two were being separated. Tia Miles teaches at Harvard. She's a MacArthur Genius, recipient of MacArthur Genius Grant, and she actually attended Middlesex School here in Concord as a ABC student. So it's a bit of a homecoming to have her back virtually at the Concord Museum. So again, Maria, Sandy, thank you so much. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with the two of you on Ellen Garrison and other fascinating aspects of Concord's African and African-American and anti-slavery past.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Concord Museum as well, and
Great.
Allison.
Good night, everyone. We hope to see you again for our